Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's webinar is governance of the curriculum. Sorry about the slight delay in getting the slides to move forward there. My name is Steve Barker. That's me on the left-hand side of the screen that's in front of you at the moment, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn, who's on the other line. Good morning, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
And together, Linda and I actually are here representing Better Governor, and we're thrilled to come along and lead this webinar this morning for Governors for Schools. And just before we kick off this morning, I wanted to just very briefly make you aware of something else that's happening in the very near future. We have the launch of the first ever National School Governors Awareness Day, which is scheduled for the 22nd of February, so not very far away. And just wanted to make you aware, it's a day of activities. All of them are free to access. We're delighted that this is an initiative that we've actually organised, but we're doing it in partnership with Governors for Schools and several other organisations. We're convinced it's going to be a huge success. There will be 4 webinars in total going on during the day and lots of other activities as well. Please do follow us on Twitter. The website, that is a bespoke one that's been set up just for the day. You've got the URL for it at the bottom of this current slide. And above all else, please remember the date and join in on the day. We'd love to get as many governors as we possibly can involved in the event. Okay, so that's just the publicity section out of the way, but an important message. Hopefully you'll all agree. So at that, I'm going to mute myself and hand over to Linda to start the webinar for you.
Thank you, Steve. In this session this morning, we're going to have a focus on the curriculum in our schools, what it is, and importantly, the oversight, the role that we have as governing boards, which will be very different to the role that other people in school and pupils themselves have around the curriculum. We'll reflect on that governance role in a little bit more detail, and we'll think about what that might look like in our activities as board members. How does that actually play out in practice in our meetings and in our monitoring activities? And then we'll focus on some questions that governors can use in their discussions, in monitoring and in meetings, to deepen your own knowledge. And hopefully the beginning part of this session will either confirm for some of you who've been governors for a number of years or sometime indeed with your schools, confirm some of the information that you already know, build on that a little. And if you're new to the whole world of governance, then hopefully we'll start to build that knowledge. But this will be a vehicle for you then to go back into your separate schools and academies and think about, what do you actually know about your school and its curriculum now? What might you find out having been prompted by some of the session this morning, and therefore what remaining questions and activities in terms of monitoring might you have to ensure that your particular school is compliant with all of its requirements? So why is the curriculum in the spotlight at the moment? And there's no doubt that it is. There's been a very sharp focus during the last 22 months on what was lost, what was being lost at the beginning of the pandemic in terms of children's learning. We have focused a lot of attention as governors on the gaps and the catching up as children have returned to school. We have started to think about what bits of the curriculum we might have focused a lot of attention on when children came back, particularly around maths and English. And we might already have been having discussions as governors about, are there things that are missing? Are there things that we've not been able to put back? Have we put some things back only to find there's been a spike of infection and we've had to take those things out of the curriculum again in terms of those extra curricular activities? And this then all comes back to the work that the government was already doing before the pandemic and the introduction of the 2019 Ofsted framework, a new framework, which was based on a huge amount of research around the curriculum that said that they wanted a broad and wide curriculum. What does that mean? What does it look like? How will Ofsted ensure through their inspection regime that the curriculum was in fact suitable for all children had been designed with their needs in mind. So there was already this focus in 2019 with a new framework. We have reshaped our focus as governors around some of those activities that the pandemic and some of the real instances in our schools of curriculum, and we have therefore got this spotlight that shapes our thinking. We have a national curriculum, and that is a range of subjects that need to be taught. That was introduced in 1988, so this is a journey. Having a curriculum that met those needs has always been a matter of compliance. So as boards, we have a function to ensure that our school is compliant with its legal responsibilities. So that's the first part of our role. We have this increased focus from the new curriculum, which in some part the research found that there wasn't as wide an offer, maybe a little bit of a narrowing of hothousing some pupils through that band of academic subjects. And some schools were indeed found lacking in being able to deliver to their pupils what those pupils needed in order to be successful, both at school, and we do test pupils at different stages, but both in their interactions with each other and leading on to be successful and productive adults in their lives as they move forward. So this notion of curriculum is something that we are continuing to talk about, not just because of Ofsted, but for the reasons that I just mentioned about preparing children, helping children to have successful and happy lives. And we have at the moment, and I'm sure this is common with the discussions that you're having in your schools as governors, there is that focus around what is it that we are doing? How has it changed? What are we returning to? Had we prepared, had we done that review of the curriculum to ensure that we were meeting these new requirements, but we're also meeting the needs of our pupils, because we don't do things for Ofsted. We do things because they are the right things for the pupils in our school. And this is very much rooted in that notion that the end result of a good, well-taught curriculum is that pupils know more and they are able to do more. So that is an Ofsted quote, but it is directly linked to the fact that our young people build up a bank of knowledge, that they understand how that builds over time, and they are therefore, as a consequence, able to do more with that knowledge and therefore succeed, make that transition into the next stage of their education. So if we think a little bit more about what the curriculum is, there are a range of different briefing papers that are provided by the House of Commons. I'm not promoting this, but it is legally compliant. It sets out what, in quite a simple way, this document's only 14 pages long. The first part is possibly more useful to us as governors, but it sets out what the curriculum is and what schools therefore are required by the law to teach. And it separates a little bit those requirements into all of our state funded schools, but between maintained schools and academies. And Steve's going to say a little bit more later about just that focus of what those differences are. But the governance role is exactly the same. It is about that oversight of the curriculum to ensure that it meets the needs of all of our pupils. And that's context related, it's ability related, it's related to our own community area. But there are some key factors here that occur commonly in every school. Maintained schools in England legally must follow the national curriculum. So that's a compliance aspect. Academies and free schools are slightly different, but because parents expect a similar sort of range of subjects to be taught in all schools, and there are some legal responsibilities set out in the documents that brought that Academy Trust into being, then you will find that most academies will teach similar range of subjects. There are some that are legally required, and there are some other subjects that, whilst they're not part of that national curriculum as such, schools are required to teach them. PE is one, religious education. So there's some basic parameters here of the expectations that you would expect to find in all schools, but that's where the remit finishes, if you like, the prescription, because then it's up to individual schools and academies to design what that looks like, to assign the right amounts of time for their pupils in each of those subjects, and to spread it over a week that works in the to meet those needs of those pupils. So there's no prescription about the minimum number of hours for each particular subject, how many times a week subjects are taught, for example, and things like that. So this is a useful paper in plain English if this is a subject that is new to you as a governor, and it is an easy read, and it's one which might support that sort of basic learning if you're at that stage, or just confirm some of the things that you think you already know about the curriculum from your experience as a governor so far.
Linda, just might be worth adding at that stage, and the point about there being no minimum hours. I think it's important from a governance perspective for us to understand that the national curriculum in reality is, well, actually in the law as well, is about an entitlement to learn. So it's not specified in terms of the number of hours, for the reason that the curriculum details what must be learned, and then it's for schools to plan how much time they allocate to each of those subjects. So it's not about prescribing from a time perspective. It's saying this is what we expect our children, this is what we expect our young people to learn at each key stage.
Thanks for that clarification, Steve. So let's think a little bit now about what the role of governance is in ensuring that that is actually what is happening in each school and academy. So the 2002 Education Act applies to all of us. That requires that a school's curriculum should be balanced and broadly based. And I mentioned that term, you'll hear that in your discussions with your head teachers and senior staff in school, but that balanced and broadly based curriculum. So a range of subjects balanced to meet the needs of the pupils. And there are some key aspects that need to be included. It should include the promotion, and this is across the whole school. So this is across the whole curriculum, promoting spiritual, moral, cultural, mental, and physical development of pupils. And you can see that here there's a whole range of different areas that might touch on some of those other parts of the national curriculum we've already got in place. The expectation that there will be some opportunity for pupils to build understanding about beliefs and perspective for life, and that they should be able to know the difference between right and wrong and viewpoints of other people. And you can see some links here between that relationships, sex and health education. This has been crystallized in that new curriculum that was introduced in 2020, and which all schools are now required to deliver by the beginning of the summer term in 2021. And you'll recognize that PE is part of how physical development is being delivered. But this is a judgment in itself that Ofsted make about the school, but it's about how this works across the curriculum and how it links to that personal development judgment that Ofsted make about the pupils in the school and how well that's being provided. So you are unlikely to see that as a distinct offer in terms of the curriculum, but it's about how that is incorporated into that design of the curriculum and meeting those four needs, and with those links to other parts of the curriculum. And then importantly, the result of the curriculum that is in place in the school, along with the spiritual, moral, cultural, and mental and physical development. And you will see PHSE, that personal, social and health education, woven into your school's curriculum, and this is very much often a part of the taught curriculum, and it's a way in which some of these other aspects are brought in to deliver that. These are all opportunities to expand pupils' knowledge, build on their understanding, and then prepare children to move on to the next stage of their education. So making sure they're ready for school, if we're talking about early years, making sure that they are ready to move on to the next key stage within your school or onto a next phase of education at primary, at secondary, prepared for the world of work, in terms of careers, if we're thinking about our offer at secondary school. So these are all about how, this role of governance is enshrined in law. So this is a responsibility. This is an area that we need to find some time to focus on in order to build our own understanding as a board, but also to test whether we are actually delivering that responsibility effectively. This is all from the DfE's governance handbook. So this is very much at the centre of what we do in terms of ensuring that our pupils are able to have learning opportunities and experiences that prepare them for moving forward, despite and inclusive of any additional needs that they might have. I'm thinking just particularly about the school where I'm a chair at the moment. Our local area is part of a resettlement programme in terms of receiving refugees and asylum seekers. And just recently we've taken a number of pupils into our school which have very different needs, and we don't know exactly what those are going to be until we look at that moving forward. But this is an area where maybe our curriculum will need to be reflected on and adjusted and made appropriate, because we have not had children who have those different type of needs before. So this is a continual living understanding of how this works in your own school, and how you have that oversight as governance and build your understanding over time based on the needs of those pupils.
Couple of questions, Linda, here, if I may. We've got one from Gospel, which is an interesting one, and they're asking, where does financial literacy and education fit? And I think my response would be that that's in that broader preparation for life. There's an expectation, although it's not part of a national curriculum, there's an expectation that we are preparing children and young people for being able to function effectively and efficiently in society. So I would say it comes under that. And then there's a comment from Elizabeth, and Elizabeth saying, this seems to be quite open to interpretation. Is there an overview stroke taste of how schools are implementing this need? It is to an extent open to interpretation, but there is plenty of guidance. I mean, spiritual, moral, social and cultural, for example, has been an element of the curriculum since 2000, and there's plenty of guidance from the DfE in terms of how that can be taught, how that should be taught. I mean, it's not necessarily mired in statute or regulation, and I would say the same applies to each of those other elements.
And the other thing I would say about that, Steve, is schools are required to publish information about their curriculum on their school website. I think you're going to say a bit more about that later, but looking at how other schools are approaching that, you'll find there are some very common elements, but there are also some very distinct elements that are based, and actually probably talking about that under enrichment and extracurricular on the next slide might expand that a little bit more in some ways, and I can kind of pick up a little bit more on how some schools approach particular aspects that are meeting the needs of their own pupils. So just to sum up here, the role of governance is about compliance. It's our legal responsibility to ensure that this is what is happening in our school. What we're going to look at moving forward is how we might do that as governors, what that looks like, how we might know, and those kind of things that we can do in terms of our own research and building our own knowledge, and then making sure that it is woven into the work that we do at our meetings and in our monitoring. So thinking about this broad and balanced, and picking up both of the points that those two questions asked. First of all, we've got those meeting those requirements, the national curriculum and the other subjects, and there's information at the DfE's own web pages on the national curriculum. If you look at the national curriculum as a topic on the DfE web pages, there are some really good information resources on there for parents, and I think the parent ones are very easy to read, that would help you understand what that might look like from a governance perspective, because it's explaining what the entitlement is. So knowing that it's meeting all of those statutory requirements, understanding what that looks like. Most schools will be very well versed in understanding what they need to deliver here and how that is being put in place in their school, and they'll give that details of that curriculum offer on their website and to parents. Excuse me. And then the meeting that national curriculum and the subjects that are taught in those, the way the school has divided the school day and the term, they'll map that out over that period of time, and there'll be a lot of information that supports parents supporting children and supports teachers supporting each other in order to deliver that. In addition to that taught element in those blocks of learning during the day, there'll also be a whole range of other things that your school or academy will have considered very carefully, and they may not look the same as everyone else, but there will be some common elements around that. So thinking about enrichment and going back to that financial question, I know many secondary schools, certainly in the area where I live, do offer under their PHSE programme some understanding about having a bank account, managing your money, and aspects of that financial personal responsibility, if you like. But enrichment can be a whole range of other things as well. It can be opportunities to go on educational visits, participate in sports tournaments, go on residential trips. It can include forest school. None of these are required, but many of them really support children's learning, their social interaction, the way in which they use knowledge and connect what they've already learned to other areas. I know in Steve's school, one of Steve's schools, they have a garden, and the children grow food, and they also use it to compete competitively, but to actually help those children's learning and understand how food is grown, how it ends up on your plate, what it tastes like. Many schools have visitors in school. My own school, during the latter part of last term, had a Year 5 and Year 6 project on science, and they were looking at space, and they engaged in a program with NASA where they had a member of NASA join them by Zoom and talk about a particular element of space, and the children voiced questions, and it was a very enriching aspect of delivering science around that particular theme. But whole school theme days, creative arts weeks, World Book Days, a whole range of different things possible. This is for the school to design to meet the needs of its own pupils, and to provide that connection, that link, and that thirst and passion for knowledge. And then extracurricular opportunities, those are all those clubs and sports clubs and music clubs and theatre clubs. And my school recently started a knitting club, and this has a direct link back to helping some of those children with poor writing get better hand control. And so there are links here to a whole range of things that maybe children haven't been exposed to before, but how has it been designed in order to supplement and support the curriculum that's in place in your school? And this is where looking at your school website, having some discussion about that at governing body meetings might help you understand what is unique and what is legally delivered and how that connects together. So at this point, I'm going to hand back over to Steve, and he's going to take you into, so what does this look like in practice? You're muted, I think, Steve, because I can't hear you.
Sorry, I do apologise, folks. I'm man and machine not in perfect harmony. Apologise. Just a few questions as a sort of a pause there, just before we move on. And these are, we try in all of the webinars that we do to perhaps give you a few pointers towards the sort of questions as governors we can actually ask. We're not suggesting you ask them all at the same time, of course, but these are just a bit of a summary of what Linda's said so far and the things that as governors we are expected to know, the things that we should be finding out. So first and foremost, of course, coming back to that phrase of broad and balanced, hopefully everybody's clear on what we mean by that now. That is about the taught curriculum as well as everything that's actually added onto that through the range of enrichment activities and extracurricular. I think what we need to bear in mind is, as governors, how do we know? What evidence can we lay our hands on? What evidence can we actually refer to that gives us that knowledge that our curriculum is broad and balanced? Again, we've had a couple of comments and questions actually on the panel, which I've been answering privately as we've gone on through the session, but a lot of them relating to early years and post-16. Just to be clear, the national curriculum runs from Key Stage 1 up to Key Stage 4, but we have to be very mindful that the post-16 programmes, i.e. A-levels, and of course at the other end of the spectrum, early years, they are outside of the national curriculum. Nonetheless, they are statutory for those groups of pupils, and therefore this is still part of that broader compliance. So if you have early years, if you're in a primary school, or post-16 provision if you're in secondary, then everything that we've said in terms of the role of governance is exactly the same here. I think it's important for us as governors not to be able to recount every single element. And again, the last two bullet points really can be handled in one here. From an enrichment perspective and also for extracurriculum, we don't need to learn rote style every single aspect of provision, but it's helpful for governors to actually have an understanding that in order, for example, in a primary school to support the teaching of reading and writing, we regularly, pandemic aside, either take children to the theatre or to literature festivals, book festivals, etc., or we bring drama groups into the school. Those are good enrichment activities, and there are a couple of really sensible examples that we are able to say as governors, yes, I can understand how that actually supports the taught elements of the national curriculum. And similarly, things like chess clubs, drama clubs, film societies, whatever you might offer in terms of extracurricular in your schools, they are also a good way of supporting, bolstering the maths curriculum, the English curriculum, etc. as well. So just to bear those in mind, some questions, don't ask them all at the same time, I would suggest, but of course what we're really getting to as governors is this is all about our strategic overview that has to be informed by evidence, and hence that last question. So for us as governors, what we would like to think is that most of the evidence that we can lay our hands on is either reflected in the minutes of our meetings or is in supporting documentation that perhaps has been used to inform meetings of the board or its committees rather. So if we move on, want to unpick the national curriculum in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to talk you through every key stage here. I think that would be a little less than lively, to say the least, but just so that you know, as governors, each and every one of us can actually go onto the .gov.uk website. Again, you don't have to actually know the particular URL. Google or whatever your preferred search engine is, just national curriculum, you will find it. All I've done here is actually given you on the right hand side of the screen an example of what is within the national curriculum for key stages 1 and 2. But I think it's important, and again we've quoted a couple of different documents this morning. Governance Handbook, which I hope is something that all of you are familiar with. If you're not, we have given you the URL for that at the penultimate slide. National curriculum sets out the subjects and associated programs of study that must be taught at each key stage. That's what it says in the Governance Handbook. So again, it's about what must be taught, because the national curriculum, as I said a little bit earlier, is all about children and young people's entitlement to learn. So on that box on the right-hand side, you will see there the whole list of subjects going right the way through from English down to languages, bizarrely still called ancient and modern foreign languages, although there's a plan at the moment from the DfE which is being consulted on to actually change not just the content at some key stage 3 and 4 of languages, but also to change the title of that particular element of the national curriculum. But they're all listed there, and of course, as governors, part of our statutory role in terms of compliance should be about ensuring that they are all taught. Helpfully, you can just see that I've actually managed to clip in the frame here that you've also got the non-national curriculum, but nonetheless, as Linda mentioned earlier, statutory elements reflected there as well. PSHE is not compulsory at Key Stage 1 and 2, although many schools will be teaching it as part of that broader, and again, it may not be called PSHE, it might be called a whole variety of different things in our schools. Again, different phases. Secondary, for example, you might often see a C in there for careers, but whatever schools are doing in terms of that personal development, that will be included in that area. And for some schools, that will also include citizenship, but again, that's not compulsory at Key Stage 1 and 2. And again, if you're if you have an early years and you're interested in that, there is a new curriculum that came into place in September. It's called the Early Years Framework, and you can actually, again, similarly search for that. You'll find the content of that. If you're a governor in a secondary school and want to find out more about Key Stage 3 and 4 or the post-16 programs of study, then again, they're all on the National Curriculum website.
Steve, there's a question from Ralph, which I think is a really good one in order for us to just clarify what we're talking about by governance role. And what Ralph's saying is it the responsibility of governors to review all lesson content and compare it against the curriculum to see if the school is sufficiently meeting the curriculum requirements?
I think, yeah, we are, to an extent, we're coming to that a little bit later, but I think the simple answer to that, so it's Ralph, isn't it, but for me, it would be no. Governors need to, there's a phrase that Linda and I often use in training sessions with governors and discussions with governors on a broader basis, and that's our role can be summed up in 4 words. What we do as governors is we ensure by seeking assurance. And I think what we should be doing, it's not for us to check how much time is given to each subject, whether they crop up on the timetable, but we would want that assurance. And I'm going to come on to a sort of a checklist bit at the end of it. So hold that thought, but in essence, no, it's not for us to actually check the content. The school should be monitoring that on our behalf, but we should be provided with the assurances, I would say. Is there anything you would add to that, Linda?
And I think this is where sometimes we confuse that our role, this is very operational. What Ralph is suggesting is very operational, but initially, if we're thinking, well, we want to be legally compliant, the only way we think we can do that is to actually do that job ourselves. It's understanding that there is a strategic way of approaching this as a board member, which does not lead us down that line of saying, I need to do this in some kind of operational detail. And that's where I would absolutely agree with this is how do we do that role of ensuring that without getting unduly operational?
I would absolutely agree with that. So moving on to this next slide. This is a bit about the bit, if you like, that comes beyond the national curriculum. So daily act of collective worship, which basically is an assembly or something that meets the requirements, that is a statutory requirement in all schools. And a couple of questions we had on the panel earlier about the distinction between academies and maintained schools. Linda reference the fact that academies will have a contractual agreement. It's called a funding agreement with the Department for Education when they were first set up. That funding agreement actually spells out what academies must do, and that includes compliance with the daily act of collective worship. It is a statutory requirement enshrined in regulations for all maintained schools. So every school must do something that actually meets the requirements. Now, again, daily is fairly obvious what that means, but collective worship means people coming together. The requirement says it should be of a broadly Christian nature. However, there is a lot of flexibility in that to reflect the diversity of our country now, and the diversity of our schools as well. But as long as we are bringing youngsters together for an opportunity for some spirituality, and that does not have to be faith-based, and other elements of reflection, etc., that does meet the requirement. Religious education, Linda's already talked about. Few questions about PSHE were coming up on the board. PSHE, as I said a few moments ago, is not statutory of itself, but very often will be the subject area that you might see marked up on a curriculum map or a curriculum plan for each of your schools. Does include very often some statutory elements. So Linda's already mentioned relationship, sex and health education, the new statutory requirement that came into force in 2020. That's statutory, therefore it's got to be taught somewhere. For many, it will find itself into personal, social and health education. The whole area of SMSC, as it's often referred to, spiritual, moral, social and cultural education, that includes British values. Now, of course, that underpins a lot of the anti-radicalisation agenda, but again, statutory, and we would want to see that coming through. So from an assurance point of view, coming back to that last question, no, as governors, as Linda said, it's highly operational. We don't go and check what's being taught, but we should, if we are having a discussion about compliance, about perhaps safeguarding, and I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail on that next bullet point in a moment, but the prevent duty and the other anti-radicalisation, anti-terror requirements, as governors, we should seek assurance. Well, where does that fit in the curriculum? How is that taught? And if head teachers feed back to us, well, that a little bit of that actually comes into relationships in early years, building on through Key Stage 1, and by the time children get to Key Stage 2 and they're ready for secondary school, they have a very firm understanding of what those British values are. And then, as I say, on a broader element of safeguarding, of course, there are lots of requirements now. Keeping children safe in education, which is the main safeguarding regulatory framework for schools. Last year, made it absolutely crystal clear. It's been there for some time, but made it crystal clear last year that teaching children how to be safe online as part of the broader teaching and learning associated with safeguarding absolutely is a statutory requirement. It's now part of the responsibility of the designated safeguarding lead in our school. It's not just online safety, it's all other elements, but again, they are statutory because they're actually part of keeping children safe. And therefore, again, this comes back to compliance. Okay, I said we'd come back to academies in a little bit more detail. Just a few points to make on here. Linda's already talked about the national curriculum and how it is mandatory for all maintained schools. It's not a statutory requirement in academies. However, as Linda said, many will follow it for all those reasons that she talked about earlier. Having said it's not mandatory in academies, the teaching of English, maths and science absolutely is. But of course, academies are free to adopt whatever schemes of work, whatever curriculum plans they wish. But ultimately, again, as Linda mentioned earlier, parents have an expectation that their offspring will be able to access GCSE A-level curriculum, which are absolutely based on the national curriculum, of course, and without following a curriculum that at least approximates very closely to the national curriculum, our young people are not going to be in a position to be successful with GCSEs, etc., unless the school is doing that. There will be some academy trusts out there. In fact, there are, we absolutely know for a fact, where the curriculum strategy that the academy trust has in place may be linked to sponsors. So, for example, Linda and I were talking about this yesterday afternoon, and Linda mentioned that there are a couple of agricultural colleges, well, there may be more than a couple up and down the country, who are academy sponsors. Part of their deal, shall we say, in terms of sponsoring, is that agricultural science, husbandry, and all of those other issues that are part of their remit are fed into to supplement the curriculum in those schools within the academy trust. And therefore, the curriculum, the way what's taught, but also the way in which it's taught may well be very different. It might look different there. We may have young people actually going to the agricultural college, perhaps going to farms and other horticultural sites, etc., to access part of the curriculum. That's absolutely fine. That's what the academy program has actually introduced in terms of flexibility and freedom for schools. But ultimately, whatever the curriculum, and I think this is probably the key point that both Linda and I have been stressing as we've gone through this session this morning, the key point here is governance is governance. So therefore, our governance, our strategic overview of the curriculum in our schools should be the same, irrespective of whether we're a maintained school, whether we're an academy, or whether we're an academy trust that has a very specific stance on its curriculum. So in terms of what that overview of governance ought to look like, I've tried to actually summarize this on this next slide, particularly from a maintained school perspective. As I say, this is primarily because obviously we put the slant here on the national curriculum, but hopefully you'll see how this equates into the academy sector as well. So as governors, what we should be ensuring, or what we should be seeking that assurance on. So as governors, we ensure by seeking assurance, as we said earlier. Teaching time is not specified in the law. It's not specified in the framework, as we've said already. But have we got enough teaching time to ensure that the national curriculum and the other statutory subjects are actually covered? And those will be matters that hopefully are discussed routinely in our schools when planning the curriculum, when planning the timetable. And of course, they are things that should be constantly referenced. We had a couple of questions on the panel earlier about truncating the curriculum during that period of school closures when remote learning was in place for large majority of the pupil body in this country. There is very much a feeling now that all schools should at least be getting back to very near what the situation was before the pandemic hit in terms of offering that full, broad and balanced curriculum. So a classic example, and again, we had a comment about the content of the computing curriculum. Computing curriculum in a lot of schools possibly has been a casualty. There'll be other subjects as well that might have been, but actually as governors now, from a compliance perspective, we need to be asking those questions about, are we meeting the needs of all pupils in terms of their entitlement to access the full curriculum? And also, how much time are we actually allocating to that? A great way of looking at, we'll come back to how we can monitor this in a few moments, but if you're a parent governor, hopefully you'll have a very clear idea about what your children are being taught. But even if you're not, there's a statutory requirement to publish curriculum details on the school website. So that's a great place to look. You don't always need to ask questions of head teachers, other senior leaders. You can actually check for yourself on the school website. And I think that's a good starting point. boards are also expected, governing boards, to ensure that not just do we have a curriculum structure in place, but we have a curriculum structure that's underpinned by appropriate and relevant assessment processes and procedures, so that teachers know that pupils are making progress and then can actually think about, okay, if children and young people are secure in what they've learned today, I can then move on tomorrow to the next stage and the next sequence lesson in that. And of course, the other element, and again, you can see the little footnote at the bottom, all of this comes from the Government Handbook in terms of spelling out what our responsibilities are. Governors have to ensure that all courses provided for pupils below the age of 19 lead to those qualifications such as GCSEs, etc. They have to be approved by the Secretary of State. And those of you who've been governors for some time might be aware, hopefully you'll be aware, that when it started, when Michael Gove was Secretary of State for Education, there was a big review of what were seen to be acceptable qualifications, and a lot of qualifications that our schools, secondary schools, used to offer have had, if you like, their currency removed from them. So there is an approved list. It's a list that's approved by the Secretary of State, and that does change on a fairly regular basis. So if you're a governor in a secondary school, you have to ensure that you are compliant with the most up-to-date list in terms of those qualifications that are being offered. And as I hinted at a few moments ago, great place to start in terms of our monitoring activity is, of course, the school website. I just picked one at random. I must stop using the word Google. I used my preferred search engine and came up with one or two. Barnes Primary School wasn't the first one in my list, but this was the first one that was, aesthetically pleasing in my view, but actually more importantly, gave you a little bit of an indication of what the content is just in that single screenshot. So this is there for no other reason than to say, as governors, look at what your school's website actually has in terms of curriculum content on it, and actually check that out, that that's compliant. I'll come on to that in just a moment. But actually, go online if you've got the opportunity, look at what other schools are doing and compare and contrast, because that can be a very informative way of forming in your own mind a picture of how good or otherwise you think your school's website might be.
Steve, there's a question that's come up on the chat, just from Sheila, talking about, well, what she's asking is, how as a governor do we know what is enough? And that's quite a wide question, but I think this is often a question that does worry governors, that how do we know? And I would say, simply put, it would be by looking at how our pupils are able to move on as they finish their time with us in our school. So if it's enough, all pupils are able to be successful. If it's not enough, then looking at our school self-evaluation, looking at our school improvement plan, where is it we can see that we are addressing that? If there are any areas or subjects, if we're at secondary school, or parts of our school community, if we're looking at pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, that is how we know that it is enough. It is not by looking, again, getting deep into the operational. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Steve, but it's often a question that governors ask.
It is not, and I absolutely agree with your response, of course. And I think the only thing I would say just further to that is, in terms of the detail, if you're in a primary school, how many of your pupils achieve that good level of development, as it's called at the end of early years? What areas of the early years curriculum are they perhaps not performing as well, as I would say? And similarly, at the end of Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, if children are transitioning from one school to another, think about what sort of feedback do we get from the schools that we actually feed into. At the end of Key Stage 2, for example, there is an expectation that languages are at least introduced into the curriculum. What does your secondary school say? Do they think that pupils are coming up to secondary school prepared for learning whatever modern foreign languages they're learning at Key Stage 3? Or is there some feedback that says, well, there's a bit of a mixed picture. We've got some schools that feed into us where children are absolutely clearly a good diet at primary, and there are others where actually they're struggling a little bit. So, there's some anecdotal information that we can ask for and our schools can be seeking, but there's also the hard facts. But as Linda said, ultimately, we're judging it on outcomes. And of course, the national curriculum also has what are called age-related expectations. So in other words, by the end of Key Stage 2, children are expected to know X, Y, and Z. Lovely. Okay, let's move on at that stage. I mentioned the website, and again, Linda and I have made this point many times in lots of different webinars over the years that we've actually been working with governors for schools. But a very good activity for new governors, we often say, is go and have a look at your school's website, check it out against what, and there's a document called What Maintained Schools Must Publish Online. There's a sister document or a mirror document for academies, surprise, surprise, called What Academies Must Publish Online. Both of them were updated. Actually, the academies one was updated in 2020, not 21, but Maintained Schools was updated last year. It has a specific section on the curriculum. And all I've done here is just done a screenshot and snipped it and put it onto the side. So I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading it out to you, but this gives you a very good indication of what your website should say. So again, as an action, if you want a call to action from this webinar today, this would be a really good place to start. Download the What You Must Publish Online, or you don't have to download, you can just look at this particular page, or we will be sending the slides out to everybody after the event. We had a slight technical glitch in getting them across to governors for schools this morning, so apologies that you've not got them yet, but you will. But look at this slide and then look at your school's own website and just see how you compare. Wanted to touch on Ofsted, and again, when Linda put that slide up right at the beginning of the session talking about the curriculum being in the spotlight, there's a part of me that thinks that it's been in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. It shouldn't be in the spotlight. It should always have been centre stage in our overview, our strategic overview as governance, because Ofsted have changed the lens of inspection and put that spotlight very firmly on the curriculum since September 2019. I think that's almost led to a bit of a knee-jerk reaction in a lot of our schools. And it's understandable. Ofsted is seen as quite formidable, and perhaps on a scale from formidable up to terrifying in many instances, I guess, for a lot of schools. And schools, of course, for obvious reasons and absolutely correct reasons, want to be seen to be doing well when Ofsted arrive. But as Linda said, we should never do what we do because we think Ofsted are coming. What we do is, as governors, we hopefully ensure, and again through seeking assurance, that our schools are providing the best possible learning and the best possible care for our pupils all of the time, because that's what we passionately believe schools ought to be about. That said, Ofsted, of course, is part of the backdrop, and therefore we have to think about, okay, there's been a lot going on in Ofsted. There are implications for our schools, as Linda said earlier, but there are different implications for us as governors. And I think what we need to appreciate is that the language or the lexicon of Ofsted has changed. It's evolved over time. We've got this judgment that Linda talked about, the quality of education, and the curriculum is absolutely the backbone of that. But putting the curriculum under the spotlight in an Ofsted framework is a very operational element of our school's work. It doesn't change our overview as governance, and I think we have to be very careful that we don't get sucked into believing that it is absolutely vital in terms of our oversight. So we've got these new words: intent, implement, and impact, as far as the curriculum is concerned. That's fine, doesn't change anything. For intent, read vision. We've always had to have a vision in our schools, and most of our schools hopefully will have a vision that encompasses some reference to the curriculum and what we're teaching, what we're planning to teach in order to achieve those outcomes for our pupils. Implementation is just saying, have we got good quality teaching and good quality learning and assessment processes in place? That's always been part of our remit as governors. It doesn't change. And of course, impact, whether we call it impact, whether we call it outcomes, doesn't matter. That's always been, well, I say always, certainly for the last 15 years or so, has been absolutely the backbone of governance. are our schools delivering the best possible outcomes for pupils? In other words, what difference does the curriculum and the way it's being delivered make to that learning journey that our children go on? So the words may have changed, and a lot of what Ofsted look at when they come into schools is changed, but actually the reality is it doesn't really impinge on us, because as governors, we are not, and we should never aim to be, curriculum experts in our schools. Ofsted don't expect us to be, and actually our schools shouldn't be. Some of us have, I think, inadvertently been sucked into the that space and think, well, how much of an expert am I on a deep dive? Can I, have I got my air cylinders to support me when I'm diving deep? And that's not the intention at all. It really isn't. And I just wanted to quote, there's a document that Ofsted published in 2019 called Inspecting the Curriculum. It's guidance for inspectors primarily. It's in the public domain, so of course it's available to schools as well. And that talks about the way in which Ofsted inspect our schools, particularly looking at the curriculum. And what it says is that there are, the methodology that Ofsted use basically has got three elements to it. The top level view, which is where they're actually talking to school leaders at the beginning of the inspection and saying, how good do they think the curriculum offer is, and what's it trying to do? So very much focusing on the intent, and of course some of the implementation there, and of course ultimately they'll think about some of the outcomes as well. They then get into, and this is the controversial one, deep dive. Deep dive is a term, or deep dives is a term that Ofsted have coined to use that more detailed exploration of individual subjects within the curriculum, where they're gathering evidence to say, well, okay, we've talked about the intent. Can we see that actually in place in the classrooms and in terms of the planning and the vision that the subject leaders or heads of department have? They'll look at the implementation and impact as well, of course they will. But that's a process that's done primarily now with middle leaders, so with those subject leads and heads of department. And it's quite interesting because the expression that's actually used there is the intent of a deep dive is to seek to interrogate and establish a coherent evidence base on the quality of education. So they're coming at it absolutely from that perspective of, is the curriculum good enough? Is it taught well enough? Are pupils learning well enough as demonstrated by their outcomes? And of course, part of the teaching, in terms of is teaching good enough, revolves around the quality of assessment in that as well. It then goes on to say the third phase is about bringing it all together, which is about the role of inspectors and saying, we've got lots of different pieces of evidence, let's pull those together, connect them all together in terms of a final judgment. No mention of governance at all. This document only has one reference to governance, and that comes in the next paragraph. And then it says, further evidence gathering activity will follow in order to test the emerging conclusions from this work. This is likely to include follow-up conversations with leaders, members of staff, and those responsible for governance. So again, very much in line with everything that Linda and I have said, this is actually all about our strategic overview. We don't have to be divers, we really don't. We just have to know that the school has got a broad and balanced curriculum. And as, again, if we can throw in some examples of enrichment and extracurricular, so much the better. But we need to be able to demonstrate, primarily through the outcomes, that we've got a curriculum that actually is fit for purpose and is actually leading to appropriate outcomes, preparing our children and young people for the next stage of their lives. So in terms of what governors need to know, we need to know we've got a compliant curriculum, as we've stressed throughout. We actually need to know that subject leads or heads of department do know that the curriculum for their subject is being implemented right the way across their school. Whether you're a Key Stage 1 only school with early years, whether you're a through primary, whether you're a secondary or an all through school, is there progression? Are children, are young people learning as they're going through? Do heads of department know that? How do they ensure that their subject is as good as they hope it would be in their school? That we do need assurance on as governors, not by going in and monitoring it ourselves, but by feedback. So how are leaders, middle leaders and senior leaders monitoring that in the school, and what are they feeding back to us as governors? And of course, ultimately, is the curriculum actually leading to appropriate outcomes for our pupils? Because if it's not, Doesn't matter what we say, how we dress it up, if there aren't good outcomes at the end of it, irrespective of our schools, and this goes for special schools and nurseries, as well as mainstream schools, if children and young people are not getting good outcomes, we have to actually think about, is the curriculum appropriate enough? Is it being taught in a way, in other words, is it being implemented in a way that is most appropriate to the needs of our pupils? So in terms of our monitoring, I think it's actually worth thinking about how we structure that. The curriculum will, for an awful lot of our schools, feature in the school development or school improvement plan at this point in time. So for an awful lot of us, read the head teacher report. That should be feeding information back to you about how the curriculum is moving on. Even if it isn't, and I say for most of us it will be, but it is still a good idea to have, I've put annual here, it doesn't have to be annual, but regular, I would suggest, a regular curriculum review. And that has to focus on certainly areas of compliance, including the website, but compliance has changed in the last 12 months because we have, well, the last academic year, sorry, I should say, because of the introduction, for example, of relationship, sex and health education, but also because of the emphasis and the new guidance from the Department for Education on peer-on-peer sexual abuse and violence. Schools now are expected, all schools, to thread that through. So part of a curriculum review should be us as governors saying, well, where does that fit in now? We need to focus on what other changes have there been. So, for example, the early years foundation stage curriculum, completely different now. Well, not completely different, but it's a completely new document with some very significant differences in terms of focus on early reading, for example, and the structure of Key Stage 3. There's a lot going on there in all of our schools on a continual basis to think about the options that we're offering at Key Stage 3 for youngsters to actually take in terms of chosen pathways for GCSEs, etc. So are we keeping up to date with that? How does that impact on our strategic overview? And as ever, and I'm sorry we keep banging the drum on this, but governors do need to have a bit of an insight. Again, we don't have to learn it all by heart, but we do. It would be very helpful, I think, as governors to be able to throw in a couple of examples in conversations. I do know that we have a film club, for example. I do know, as Linda mentioned, the infant school where I'm, or the infant school, which is one of the schools where I'm chair, we have a gardening club. I know that because I actually run it. But that's part of what our school does as part of its extracurricular stroke enrichment activity. And therefore, it's important to understand how that links back to the science curriculum, the maths curriculum, etc.
I think the other thing that I found very useful recently and hadn't considered in this light until looking at this slide is that we had the local authority come and do a visit with our school, giving an external report to the school and the governing body. But what they were looking at in particular was the could children articulate their learning? That was a focus. And listening to pupils, I attended as an observer. I didn't have a role to play, but it was a governor visit, which I've written up nonetheless. The children were able to connect back when they were talking to the local authority advisor, different elements of their learning. For example, one child had represented something with a Venn diagram, and when the local advisor asked them, where else do we use Venn diagrams, the child was able to say, in maths and science. And you could see that the knowledge that the children had and the way in which they'd used it was linking some of these things together and was a real evidence of how the school was sequencing and meeting its needs as it had laid out in the school development plan, because this was an area that the local authority had come to look at. So monitoring visits with your, if you've got a lead in school, whatever way you structure it, and that's entirely up to your board, but you're delivering the school improvement plan, there will be monitoring visits that will allow you to have a slightly deeper understanding of some of these elements, and you feed that back to the other members of your board through your reports. It's all part of that monitoring activity.
Absolutely. And in fact, just one other quick word to add on the changes. So, for example, things like early years foundation stage, Key Stage 3, any other elements of change. Something else to think about as governors is part of that should maybe be feeding into the professional development of teachers, and things like subject networks that are available in a lot of authorities, teachers able to access resources from social media. There are, certainly on Twitter, there are some very specific platforms for sharing resources, etc. All of those are ways in which we know that the curriculum is actually being considered, is being developed and evolved on a continual basis. I'm just aware of the fact the clock is ticking by, but that does bring us to the end of what we wanted to say. Thank you for all of the questions that have actually been sent in this morning. I do apologise if we've not answered all of your questions individually, but there's a very large number of people on this webinar this morning. What we will do, as we always try to, is actually review all of the questions they are kept, and we'll get back to you individually with those questions that are unanswered. Just want to say thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. We've given you the reference URLs there for the documents that we've focused on. As I say, thank you very much for joining us. Did want to just have a final reminder. Sorry, I didn't mean to actually flick the slide over there, but final reminder, School Governors Awareness Day on the 22nd of February. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day. Come back and see us again soon. Thank you very much indeed.